Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of Molex 3D's webinar series. My name is Srikar Valluri, and I'll be your host today. The topic for today is going to be lightweighting and foaming as the focus of today's webinar. The topic or the focus for today is foaming. As all of you know, lightweighting is something that has been a focus across industries, especially true for the automotive industry. And there are different types of lightweighting that, depending on the application, companies are trying to evaluate or study. And like fiber fill materials, composite materials, other manufacturing processes, and foaming is one of them. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about in today's session, is foaming portion in the lightweighting series. So when you talk about foaming as such can be divided into multiple different types. So you have thermoplastic materials or your resin matrix, you have thermoset materials, and depending on the kind of blowing agent you have or the process you have, there are multiple different categories for foaming. So for example, you could have a thermoplastic material combined with a chemical blowing agent, right, to cause some sort of a chemical foaming happening. Or you could have a physical foaming process happening, like Mucil. When you have thermosetting materials, you can have a material like polyurethane that, foaming occurs upon mixing the different components. So we're going to touch upon each of these different aspects of foaming and look into each one, at a high level to see what is the process about, what are the challenges that this process faces, and how does simulation help in evaluating that particular foaming process. Now, when you talk about challenges involved with foaming, there are multiple different challenges, and it can be, as can be expected, depending on the stability of the foam itself, there can be a challenge in controlling the process, right, to get the right part quality. Trying to understand your temperature pressure relationships, trying to understand gas dosage amounts or anything of that sort. So like I said, we are going to touch upon each of these topics briefly. The first type of foaming that we're going to touch upon is physical foaming, and in particular, the Mucil process. Mucil process is a patented trademark of Trexel company. So I'm going to take an example and walk everybody through how does it work, what does it look like, a Mucil process on an example part. So what you see on this slide is a sample part. This was an actual part designed and molded by Protolabs, and what they were looking at was, as you can see, the part itself has multiple different things going on with the design. It's not a straight fill. There are bends, meaning your directionality of flow is changing. There are features like holes that tend to cause surface defects, net lines, and then your wall thickness. It's not a uniform wall thickness. You have ribs on the B side that causes your wall thickness ratio to be different, right? And also, such a ribbing structure can cause sink marks to show up on the A side. So, and it being a U-shaped part like this, it can have an adverse effect on warpage. So multiple different things that were going on with this design. It was designed with the purpose of evaluating a Mucil process versus a conventional molding process. So what you see here is your standard set of processing conditions, comparing your actual conventional injection molding process versus a Mucil process. You see how much of a difference there is in your cycle time, actually. So just to give everybody a quick background, Mucil process basically works this way. You have your resin that is injected with supercritical fluid. Right? In other words, your gas, which could be nitrogen, carbon dioxide, they are injected into your resin at in a supercritical fluid state. And then the mixture is injected into your mold like an injection molding process. Now, when there is a pressure drop, then your actual foaming begins, right? Your gas bubbles start to increase in size. Foaming accelerates the flow. It pushes the flow to fill out the part. So in any sort of foaming process, your packing phase is replaced by the foaming, and that also helps reduce your cycle time. And that's what you see here. That's why you see a difference between your cycle times and, of course, your shot weights. So if you look at these four, you see quite a bit of variation or reduction in your cycle time, your shot weight, your clamping tonnage requirements, your pressure requirements for the Mucil process. Now, when you look at a comparison of the conventional injection molding process with Mucil, you can immediately see how much of a difference Mucil has to the part surface quality in terms of reducing those sink marks. So a comparison was done in this study, actually, comparing a conventional injection molding process where you can actually see these sink marks for those ribbed structure on the A surface versus a Mucil process where you don't see the sink marks. However, with the Mucil, you still see other sort of surface defects. The surface is not of the best quality, even though your sink marks are no longer visible. So in order to improve that, they looked at a periotherm process, like a rapid heating and cooling process. So if you look at just the rapid heating and cooling process without the Mucil process, then you still have your sink marks on the A side. However, when you combine the Mucil with your rapid heating and cooling, your overall part surface quality was much, much better. So that gives us an indication of how is Mucil helping to improve, in this case, your sink marks, but also the process itself can be combined with a variotherm process or a rapid heating and cooling process to improve your overall part surface quality. So from a simulation perspective, you can evaluate how good is the foaming with this Mucil process. So simulation allows you to look through the cross-section of a part and identify what your cell structure is like. In other words, when I say cell structure, what I mean is it is a foaming process, which means there are gas bubbles that are forming and increasing throughout and spreading throughout your part. So when you look through the cross-section, you are able to look at what is the size of your gas bubbles or what is the density of your gas bubbles. Both these are important. Both the size as well as the density or the number of bubbles define how good of a foaming have you had. So for this part, when you take a look at the cross-section of the part closer to the gate, you are able to see what your cell size distribution is like. So close to the gate, you see that the cells are very small in size. And that basically corresponds very well with SEM scan taken of the actual part, of the actual cross-section, which shows the average cell size to be around or less than 2 microns. Now, on the other hand, when you look at the same cell size distribution towards the end of flow, what you see is basically that your cell size is much higher now, which means at the gate, you have very small cell sizes, but as your flow progresses, as you're nearing towards the end of flow, as your flow length increases, your cell bubbles have time to increase in size, of course, given the right pressure and temperature conditions. So then, towards the end of fill, your cell sizes are much bigger, which indicates good foaming. And that is what you're able to visualize from the simulation. When you look at a cross-section of the part, towards the end of fill, you can see higher cell sizes, which correspond, again, with the SEM scans taken on the part cross-section at the same location. Now, contrary to this, your cell density should show the opposite behavior. In other words, at the gate, you should have a large number of cell bubbles or gas bubbles, right? But as your flow progresses, as the cell size increases, you should be seeing a reduction in the number of bubbles you see towards the end of fill. And that is exactly what you're able to visualize from the simulations in this case. And they, again, correspond well with what the SEM scans show you. So now that an evaluation of your foaming structure itself has been done, this study extended this into looking at the part's physical performance or structural performance. So what was done is the simulation results, including the density of the part, the porosity, in other words, your cell size and density distribution, was exported out to anisotropic material modeling software like Digimap, and then on to MSE Mark. So obviously FEA analyses can be done with multiple different packages. In this study, Digimap and Mark were chosen to conduct this analysis. And when you look at what the comparison looks like within Mark for your overall mesh mapping and the mapping of the results, you can see that they are very consistent with each other. Now, once that was done, the series of tests were conducted to evaluate, again, the structural performance of the part. So one of the tests was bending test, like you see here. So load applied in one location and looking at, again, the force versus displacement curves. And what you see in the plot here is a comparison of your experimental versus predicted data. The green curve shows the displacement of this part experimentally, while the blue curve shows, prediction from Mark, which includes your simulation, flow simulation results. And as you can see in the linear regime, there is a very good correlation between the two. Now, follow-up to this was another bending test. It's a cantilever sort of a bending, like you see. You can see where the part is fixed and then where the load is applied to evaluate the stress and displacement in this region. And once again, same sort of a plot looking at force versus displacement. You can see how simulations are able to capture very well the actual structural performance of the part. So, which gives you an indication of how simulation can help you evaluate not only things like your part surface quality, weight reduction, process savings, or cycle time savings, but also evaluate structural performance of parts. So that is a brief case study I wanted to share in terms of MuCell. Now, the next case study is the next type of foaming I want to cover is polyurethane chemical foaming. When you talk about polyurethane chemical foaming, this is actually very different from any other types of chemical foaming, be it physical or chemical. The biggest difference between this and MuCell that we saw in the previous example is, of course, this is chemical, which means there is intrinsic chemical reaction that is happening. But this also doesn't need any external blowing agent or external catalyst to trigger the foaming. The foaming occurs when different components of polyurethane itself are mixed, right? So the raw materials, as you can call them, are essentially different components of polyurethane itself. And another thing that happens is, while it is foaming, it is also curing because it is a thermosetting material. So there are two types of kinetics that are going on at the same time. On the one side, the temperature, higher temperature, causes the material to cure and solidify, while on the other side, the foaming tries to, the foaming occurs and it tries to push the melt forward. So at some point, these could be opposing forces as well. So this slide just gives you a quick indication of the kind of chemical reaction that actually occurs and ultimately causes carbon dioxide to be released and foaming to occur. What you see here is basically a validation study done in terms of the kind of temperature increase that occurs over time because of the reaction, and how simulation is able to capture that versus experiments. Similarly, the validation showing what is the foaming density like versus time. So in other words, the more foaming that occurs, the lesser is the density of your overall part, which can be understandable because now your part has more gas. So what simulation can do for polyurethane foaming is you're able to visualize not only standard outputs like how does your flow front progress, what is your progression like, where are your elastable areas, etc. But you're also, from results like this, able to get an understanding of at what point does foaming occur. In this animation, for example, you're able to see how in the center portion of the steering wheel, the speed of your melt front progression is faster. But once it reaches the outer ring, the speed of your progression is slower. In other words, the foaming actually begins to dominate once your melt reaches your ring portion of this wheel, which can be confirmed in other subsequent results. You're able to look at results like what is your curing like, right? Which areas have higher curing, which areas have lower curing in terms of conversion percentage. Not to mention, what is your foaming conversion like? In other words, which areas have higher foaming and which have lower foaming. Now, once you analyze this, you are also able to then get a good idea of what is the overall density distribution like. So this tells you, which areas are denser, which areas have more gas, and ultimately, how does all of this tie into the part shrink and warp behavior? Now, when you talk about polyurethane foaming, another important aspect, depending again on the application that you would want to consider, is the gravitational effect. Now, in this example, you are looking at the same part geometry, the same type of material, excuse me, the same kinetics of the material itself, but the left-hand side shows you what your melt front progression would look like without considering the effects of gravity, while the right-hand side shows you what it would look like while considering the effects of gravity. And this helps make a big difference. So simulation allows you to include or consider the effect of gravity also on your foaming kinetics. As your foam begins to rise up, gravity will also play a role in how far up is it rising. Not only that, vent is another important aspect that simulation allows you to analyze and study. Last to fill areas, venting locations are very important when it comes to designing molds or tools for polyurethane foaming. And with simulation, you are able to identify what is a potential venting location or evaluate your current tool venting positions. So to give an example, looking at the same part geometry that we were in the previous gravity example, what you see is two scenarios. One where you have venting boundary conditions applied at both these towers. And the other scenario is where you have your vent gap applied only to one of the towers. And you can immediately see a difference in your flow progression. Where you had both the towers with venting, you can see how the shorter tower fills very quickly. Now, where you had only one of the towers with venting, the vent gap is only assigned to the taller tower, which means your flow favors that portion first. Now, you can imagine how this is a very useful tool in understanding the effect of venting in placing your venting to define your flow, right? You can affect your flow if you would like the flow to, fill out some portions of your part first or some portions of your tool first before progressing to other regions, depending again on the application. This is very much possible. In addition to that, given its polyurethane, water as a blowing agent, as part of the components of the blowing agent, has a very big effect on your foaming percentage, etc. So in this example, you are looking at the same geometry, but you're looking at two different concentrations of water in the overall composition of the polyurethane material. In other words, you can consider these to be two different types of materials, material A and material B, where the only difference between the two materials is the water concentration. On the left-hand side, you have higher water concentration, while on the right-hand side, you have lower water concentration. Now, where you have a higher water concentration, you can see how your gas volume fraction is higher, which means higher water concentration or higher water quantity in your overall composition of polyurethane allows for better foaming or higher foaming. What you also see is it allows for faster filling of some of these features as opposed to the lower water concentration. So these are some examples of what are the tools available with simulation to evaluate your overall polyurethane foaming as such. And then, of course, as direct outputs from the software, you are also able to evaluate or visualize what your bubble structure is like, right? Where are your voids? What is your void distribution like throughout your part? Taking cross sections at different locations in your part, you're able to see what your cell size distribution is like, what your cell density distribution is like, and of course, what your overall part density distribution is like. So that was a brief intro into polyurethane foaming that I wanted to share with everybody. Now, the next type of foaming that we will cover, this is the last type of foaming that we will cover today, is a thermoplastic chemical foaming, but with an external blowing agent, like a chemical blowing agent. So in such a case, the polymer matrix that is used can be any kind of thermoplastic. But when you have these external blowing agents that facilitate your foaming, right, your carbon dioxide to be released, and or nitrogen, again, depending on what the application is. But then that facilitates foaming and your lightweighting, your part filling out, etc. So a lot of times when people are looking at lightweighting, especially in the automotive industry, several cases, be it exterior, or not exterior, I mean, be it interior components or seating is again different. A lot of seating applications use polyurethane foaming. Some may use chemical blowing agent. Other interior applications also make use of chemical blowing agents for their foaming applications. So what a lot of people are always trying to see is what factor or combination of factors helps them, improve their weight savings, or the other side, right? What are the factors that would lead to inadequate foaming or insufficient foaming? Which factors are more important, etc. So what you're going to see in the next slides is a case study that we developed to showcase what could be some important factors to consider when evaluating a chemical blowing agent for foaming. So the part geometry or the model is what you see as your runner layout and part structure. Now this could be any any automotive component, not being specific to any one company, of course. It could be any component that's usually seen in your automotive applications or for your customers, I mean. The type of meshing that you're able to see, you're able to model in the pin for your hot runner components if you want to. That helps facilitate, of course, your valve gating effect, shear heating around the pin, etc. Now, for this model, wall thickness is right around 3 millimeters, which I believe is not okay. It's pretty common, between 2 and 3 millimeters. So what you see here is a comparison of your flow front progression. On the left-hand side is a simulation run without foaming, while on the right-hand side, it is with foaming. Now, what you observe here is that there is no sequence or sequential valve gating done. All the gates are opening at the same time. And again, this is just for demonstration purposes. Of course, in reality, if this was a Class A surface, you would not have all the gates opening at the same time. What you see here is a comparison of your pressure distribution in the part for with foaming and without foaming, right? And then, of course, you are able to look at what your part weight comparison is like. In this example, we were able to achieve 5% weight savings, but of course, there were several assumptions made regarding how much dosage of gas was used. And of course, like I said, no valve gating used in this example, etc. But then again, depending on the application, inputs can be tweaked and then simulation can be utilized to understand or study the importance or the feasibility of foaming for that application. And if foaming is found to be feasible, what is a good set of process conditions or process window that would get you your desired part quality? These are all things that can be evaluated with simulation. So what you see here is actually very interesting. It's a comparison of your sprue pressure history data going, during your filling process. The red curve indicates sprue pressure history curve with foaming, while the blue indicates without foaming. Now, traditional expertise or traditional knowledge tells us that the clamping tonnage or sprue pressure requirements for foaming are lower than for non-foaming scenarios. But in this case, you see the opposite happening. What you see is the foaming sprue pressure is actually higher than the non-foaming case. Now, what you also see is that your transfer point or switchover point from velocity to pressure control is also happening at different points. And why is that? With a regular injection molding process without foaming, your velocity control is what is pushing your flow front forward. But when you talk about foaming, in addition to the velocity control, you also have the gas that is trying to push your melt front forward. So that means at the same time instant, your non-foaming scenario would have more material in it than the foaming scenario, which means the time it takes to get to the transfer point for that amount of material to be pushed in is longer. So that's why you actually see different switchover points. Now, what you also notice is up until your switchover point, your pressure requirement for the foaming case is almost identical to your solid case. It, in fact, is actually a little lower also. But there comes a point at which the pressure starts to overtake. And that is, if you actually paid a little closer attention to the flow front progression, it is also because of the kind of structures you have, kind of holes or grill structures you have, that is actually causing some sort of hesitation in flow, because the foam has to actually push your melt front forward, which is not as easy to do. So the pressure is going up in trying to fill those hard to fill areas. And interesting thing is, as your pressure goes up, the actual foaming goes down. And I will be showing you that also in one of the following slides. What you see here is basically a distribution of what your cell structure is like, what your cell size distribution looks like throughout the part. Again, near the gate versus away from the gate, you can see where you're closer to the gate, you have lower cell sizes and vice versa. Cell density corresponds again with your cell size distribution. Now the results that you see here are again on the surface. You can just as easily look through the cross section to see what the distribution is like through the cross section of the part. Now this is again the interesting result that I was talking about earlier. So what you see here is two different curves on the same time scale. The blue curve shows what your sprue pressure distribution is like, and this is just a zoomed in portion for the previous sprue pressure curve that we saw, and we are only looking at the foaming case, of course. The red curve is what we call as the gas volume fraction. This tells us how much gas is actually present in your system through the cycle, right? Throughout this shows you the history data. And what this tells us is, by the way, this peak in the sprue pressure in the blue curve is your transfer point. And what this tells us is basically that you had high foaming occurring right up until your transfer point, or right up until actually a different point before your transfer point. But there is a point in time where your gas foaming actually starts going down. All the foaming that was achieved during this time is actually going down before it starts going back up again. So what is causing this? What is happening is your sprue pressure is actually starting to increase quite dramatically towards your last to fill area. This is, again, this goes back to the hesitation in flow, which is causing the pressure requirement to go up in order to fill those areas. And as your sprue pressure starts rising up, your amount of gas volume fraction actually starts going down to the point where the savings that were achieved in terms of lightweighting are being negated by the sprue pressure. But after the transfer point, after it switches over and the sprue pressure starts going down, you can see how your gas volume fraction starts going back up. There is a critical point always. So you can see what your saturation pressure is like for foaming requirements. And once your sprue pressure starts going down, uh, your gas volume fraction again starts going up. Because as your sprue pressure increases, whatever foaming was achieved, that gas starts dissolving into the melt. And you can clearly see that phenomenon occurring through this overlay of curves between your XY plots of sprue pressure and gas volume fraction. So this gives you an indication of how you can utilize simulation tools to evaluate not only the feasibility of lightweighting, feasibility of looking at part weight savings and filling out the part well, and part surface quality, but you're also able to evaluate how much foaming is being achieved, the effect of the process itself on the foaming. Obviously, there are multiple factors that affect foaming. It could be the design, it could be the gating, it could be the process. And simulation as such provides you tools to evaluate all of these. Is the design causing hesitation in flow, which is causing the pressure to go up? And is the process causing also the pressure to go up? In other words, in this example, if the transfer point was moved further up to switch over before the sprue pressure started to increase, then the gas volume fraction that was achieved during this portion would have stayed. The foaming would actually could have continued to increase beyond this point. So these are things that you're able to analyze and visualize with simulations, and how simulation as a tool can help understand the different lightweighting technologies. So that brings me to the end of my presentation today.